let's get this show on the road. We are 1700 on the nose. Definitely the level of our opposition has been rising steadily. Let's see who we face tonight. Anita Kakar. Okay, e4. And in this speedrun, I play my official opening recommendations. We still have not gotten an accelerated dragon. This is actually kind of fascinating how few people play the open Sicilian. And again, we're not getting an accelerated, we're getting knight c3. And every time we face knight c3, which is a couple of times now, I sort of reiterate the explanation of which move you should play in response. And that depends primarily on what you play against the open Sicilian. So if you're a Najdorf player, then you should play d6. If you're an accelerated dragon player, which we are for the purposes of this speedrun, then you should play the move knight to c6. The point is that if white now plays the move knight f3, which she just did, how should we proceed with black? Well, of course, we should basically play with the understanding that our opponent is going to play d4 on the next move. So if we're an accelerated dragon player, then everything is very easy. We play g6, and in the event of d4, which I think is quite likely, we take and then we transpose directly into an accelerated dragon. Very nice. Our first one. Okay. Bishop g7, fianchettoing the bishop. And this is our first accelerated dragon. And it makes sense. We've hit 1700. This is around the time that we see more people delve into some of the main lines. All right, so in the accelerated dragon, the kind of zen of this opening is to delay the move d6. If we play d6, then we allow white to transpose into the mainline dragon, and there's nothing cardinally wrong with the dragon itself. It's just a highly theoretical and incredibly dangerous opening. The accelerated dragon essentially does not allow white to castle queenside without suffering the consequences. So we hold off on the move d6. Why do we do that? Well, we do that primarily so that we can play d7, d5, and open up the center in one fell swoop, provided that white allows this to happen. Therefore, we develop our knight first. And if you're seeing this for the first time, you might be worried about the prospect of developing our minor pieces without first pushing our pawn out to d6. But as I'll show you after the game, this is nothing to worry about. And there is a line where white tries to punish us by trading on c6 and then playing e5. But in that line, black successfully sacrifices a pawn with knight d5 and gets a very nice initiative. This is a well-known line according to theory. a3 is already a sideline. In fact, it's a move that I have never seen before. It's not a very good move. And it's not a very good move because it doesn't really do anything. I mean, a3 in this position is sort of a waste of time because we are not planning to put anything on b4. So we can essentially proceed as though white has given us another turn. And we could probably already get away with the move d5. But the problem with playing d5 before castling is that after d5, there is the very unpleasant move bishop b5. And you can kind of see why that's annoying. White pins the knight, white threatens knight takes c6, and then bishop takes c6 is going to fork the king and the rook. So as a general rule of thumb, you only want to play d5 after you've castled kingside, which is what we're going to do. We're going to castle kingside. We are now fully ready to push the pawn to d5 and open up the center, and we can really try to punish white for delaying her development here. Bishop c4. Okay, now a very important tactical detail. And this is incredibly common in the accelerated dragon. It is impossible to play the accelerated without knowing this concept. And this is called the center fork trick. And the center fork trick is ubiquitous across many different openings and with both colors, which makes it incredibly important to know. And it occurs anytime either side has a bishop on this square. Or, of course, if you're playing black, you have a bishop on c5, right? This is the precondition for the center fork trick. And what you do is actually knight takes c4 anyway. Looks like a blunder, but if you have prior knowledge of this idea, you know that it's not a blunder. Knight takes c4, you meet with the move d5. That's where the fork term comes from. And you essentially refork the knight and the bishop, and you're going to win the piece back. Now, white can give that piece away for a pawn, but in this particular version, it's not even that easy for white to win the pawn back, as you'll see. So we play the move d5. A couple of things to notice. Again, mostly if you're seeing this for the first time. If white plays the move knight takes knight, then we take back with the pawn. And even though white has opened up a line of contact to the d5 pawn, we are now protecting it with our own c6 pawn. So this is an important detail. This is indeed exactly what happens. And this is where white really, really pays the price for the move a3, because it is more common for this position to arise with white having castled instead of having played a3. So white keeping the king in the center and essentially wasting a move is really going to burn them. So what's going on here? Well, we're attacking the bishop and the knight at the same time, hence the fork. And the general kind of prescription for responding to the center fork trick is to keep your bishop pair. Books often recommend this, and this is the best move in a lot of different openings. The move bishop c4 back to d3 is often the recommended way of combating the center fork trick. And the point is that after we take the knight, white takes back the pawn and keeps their bishop pair. But if you look a little bit further in this particular situation, the b2 pawn is also hanging, and it's hanging with tempo. We take it and we attack the rook simultaneously. So that's kind of out the window. And if white's not playing bishop d3, then what is white doing? Well, white can probably take on d5, but then we recapture with the pawn. And again, we have the bishop pair, we're attacking the knight. The knight can't move back to c3 because white gets forked again, this time on the 4th rank. And if white doesn't move to c3, then again, white loses the b2 pawn with tempo. So there's just nothing that white can do which comes even remotely close to equalizing. Knight g3 is her choice. Okay. Well, what do we do now? Well, a very bad move here would be to play bishop takes b2. And I think newer players might be tempted by the look of that move, because you might say, well, let's grab that pawn and attack the rook. And when the rook moves, then we can take the bishop. The problem is, remember that we have already sacrificed a piece. So bishop takes b2 allows white to move the bishop away from c4. And if we then take the rook on a1, white takes back with a queen. And technically, black is even up material in the resulting position because we have a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 pieces. But in most middle game situations, 2 pieces are preferable to a rook. And you particularly want to avoid, when possible, giving away your fianchettoed bishop in the accelerated dragon, unless you absolutely have to, or unless there are some sort of extenuating circumstances. So bishop takes b2 would be bad. We simply recapture on c4. Now we are up a pawn. Okay, our opponent gets into an endgame. And of course, we will still need to show a good amount of technique if we want to finish our opponent off in style here. Now, c3 is a good move by our opponent, closing off our bishop. And now that the queens are off the board, we need to kind of reassess the situation. We are up a pawn. We have a bishop pair. Our bishop on c8 is not yet developed, but because the queens are off the board, our king is not in any imminent danger. It's not like we need to necessarily rush to get our bishop out. I think we have bigger fish to fry here. And the particular fish that I think we should fry is this b2 pawn. What makes me look at the b2 pawn? Well, largely it's the fact that we have a pawn on c4. And from some of my endgame videos, you might recognize this as kind of a deep freeze situation where one of your pawns is essentially keeping in place, holding down 2 or more of the enemy pawns. So that pawn on c4 is making sure that the pawn on b2 is not only a backward pawn, but has no path forward. That pawn is a huge weakness, and it's a weakness on an open file. So there is a move that's essentially begging to be played. And this is a move we can play largely without calculation, because there isn't anything to lose by playing this move. And I am thinking of the move rook to b8. Now, you might say, well, what about the a7 pawn? Well, that pawn cannot be captured, because if white would have captured it, we would have taken b2, and then the c3 pawn very likely would have also fallen. Rook b1 is just collapsed by our opponent. The rook on b1 is unprotected. LPDO, loose pieces drop off. And I know this because the rooks are not coordinated. And the move that just ends the game here is bishop takes c3 check. I can sense some people wondering if we can first play rook takes b2 and try to be fancy. The answer is no. The answer is no. Rook takes b2, rook takes b2. Bishop takes c3 check. The rook can block on d2. It's a common type of blunder. The rook that you're forking can itself block the check, And after takes, black emerges down a piece. So bishop c3 is simple and strong. Now we have two possibilities. We can play bishop takes b2, or I think the more clinical move is to play rook takes b2. We're already up essentially 3 pawns. So you should already have one eye on simplification, and trading a pair of rooks will make it easier for us as a consequence to promote the c4 pawn. So I like the move rook takes b2, and this is already game over. Our first accelerated dragon experiment has been a successful one. Yeah, bishop takes b2. White is probably going to take on a7. We're going to play c3, obviously. And the good thing about c3 is that it not only prepares to promote the pawn, it also creates an anchor point for our rook on d2. And it opens up the a6, f1 diagonal for our light-squared bishop. So we solve all of the problems with that move. Yeah, c3 we can, again, at this point I'm playing largely without calculation because there's nothing to calculate. None of our moves contain any risk at all. They're just incredibly straightforward and essentially asking to be played. Yeah, of course we can take a3. There's nothing inherently wrong with grabbing another pawn, but we can grab that pawn now if we wanted to. But I'm just trying to win the game in a more efficient manner. Now, here's the order of operations. Of course, the move that's begging to be played here is c2, and we're going to play it. But c2 doesn't actually threaten to promote. What does c2 threaten? So try to figure out what threat does c2 actually pose. And we're going to play this move next against virtually any one of White's responses. So not rook d1 immediately, because if we play rook d1 immediately, White takes on d1. And then perhaps some of you are attracted to bishop g4 check. But remember that White can block that with a pawn. Instead, we need to switch the move order. We want to go rook d1, but we want to dislodge the king from e2 first. And if you've been paying attention, this move should occur to you. Bishop a6 check, knock the king off of e2, then put the rook on d1, and the path is now essentially clear for the pawn to promote. We can either promote immediately and win a piece, or we can try to squeeze a little bit more out of the situation by deflecting the bishop off of this diagonal. If we can do that, then the promotion comes and we simply make a new queen. Yeah, this is a pretty one-sided game. Yeah, this has been a very one-sided game. H3. Okay, so again, if you're playing a blitz game, then there's nothing wrong with just taking the rook and then making a queen and getting up a bishop and a pawn and converting the resulting position. But we're trying to be as accurate as possible. I'm trying to give you a glimpse of, what GM level play actually looks like. And so we're going to put into practice an idea that I think might be a lot less obvious to people. This might be one of the least obvious ideas of this game. What we're going to do essentially is use our pawns on the king side to squeeze the life out of White's minor pieces. The knight on g3 and the bishop on e3, first of all, this is something everybody should see, are unforkable squares. What could they be forked by? Well, there's only one thing that could fork them, and that's a pawn. Now, on what square would the pawn have to be? Well, the pawn would have to be on the f4 square, but that seems pretty far-fetched, right? It seems like we're not even close to being able to establish a pawn on f4, and yet that's an illusion. We're only 3 moves away, and we've got all the time in the world here because White is totally paralyzed. And that's the beauty of, of being able to do what you want. So we're simply going to start with e5, and then on the next move, we're going to play f5. And the problem isn't only that we will be threatening f4, we will also be threatening e4, and that's almost checkmate. And even if White moves one of the minor pieces, f4 might still be incredibly effective. So for instance, as we play the move f5 here, if White moves the bishop seemingly out of sight of the f-pawn, we will still play f4, and that bishop on h6, its contact with c1 is going to be intercepted. That's even better. And White has no squares. That's it, resigns. So a simple idea. I didn't mean to overhype it, but I think it ends the game a lot faster than promoting immediately. That one was pretty fast. Let's quickly go through some of the introductory theory, and I'm sure we will get more accelerated dragon games as we go along, so I'm not going to bog you down too much in any individual game. So knight c6, knight f3, g6. So we transposed into a main line here. Bishop g7. Previously, we'd gotten a closed Sicilian. We'd gotten Grand Prix attack. We'd gotten a good amount of anti-Sicilians. Okay, bishop b3, of course, is the main move. Now we play knight f6. And the sort of introductory line that I'd like to show here is knight takes c6, bc, and e5, because this is a very important line to know. This is a very important line to know. No, pull up what I have here. Just a moment. Yeah, so here, if you don't know what to do with black, you are likely to kind of sink under the weight of this e5 pawn. As far as I know, black has two moves. Let me check which one is more popular nowadays. Yeah, knight g8 is actually the move. I apologize. What I said during the game was wrong. Knight d5 is not the correct way to play here, even though it's an interesting pawn sacrifice. But believe it or not, you actually move the knight back to g8. Now, f4 is what most people are going to play here. And it's important to realize that despite the sort of appearances, black's position is completely fine. And white has bitten off more of a chunk of the center than he can chew. Black has a couple of interesting moves here. There's f6, chipping away at the center immediately. But I like the move knight h6, redeploying the knight along the light squares that white has weakened on the king side, which is a common byproduct of this particular pawn chain. The light squares on the king side are now quite weak. So here the main move is queen d2. And you can start by castling short. And let's say that white castles queenside. There's still over 100 games in the database. Now we have to chip away at white's pawn chain with the move d6. Now this seems to give up a pawn, and it does, but now you've opened up your bishop. And the bishop is joined by the knight, which comes out to f5. But the main drawback of taking on c6 in any such position is that it opens the b file, and the b file is an absolute game changer in any position with opposite side castling. Watch how quickly that open b file can lead to white's demise. So let's say white plays de. De, queen e7. The bishop has to move because it's now hanging, bishop f2. And already here, rook b8 is a great move. But rook b8 is not the best move. And this is subtle, but hopefully everybody can understand it. Here, white can play bishop c4. And the point of bishop c4 is to drop the bishop back to b3 and block the b file. So this move is very tempting, but black is at a bit of a dead end. It's worthwhile to start with the move bishop to e6, cover the c4 square, and pre-move rook b8. When I say pre-move, I mean pre-move. Even if white plays g4, you still play rook a b8. And if white plays g takes f5, just queen b4. You don't even need to sack on b2. You just go queen b4, b3, and now bishop takes c3 is a very bad move because of queen to d6 covering the a3 square. You actually want to go rook b to d8, forcing the queen away. And if white plays queen takes d8, then we play queen a3 check. If the king moves up to d2, then we take the queen. And here we take c3, and checkmate is unavoidable on b2. So nothing insane, but a pretty nice line and a good line to know. So if we rewind, bc, e5, knight g8, f4, you redeploy the knight to h6. This is how quickly white can go down, unless white plays a bunch of computer moves. And the objective assessment of this position is equal. The engine gives 0-0, but the top engine move is something nobody's going to play. I don't think anybody's going to go h3 here. I think most people are going to go queen d2. The second most popular move here is bishop d3. Again, black's continuation is usually reliably the same. You castle and then you play d6 to try to get rid of that e5 pawn. And once you get rid of it, white is left with a ton of weaknesses. Black is left with a semi-open b file. And this pawn on f4 sticks out like a sore thumb. Actually, even stronger is to play knight g4, intermediate move. Bishop d2 and the classic. Bishop d4, king h1, knight f2 check wins in exchange. But this is actually the top engine suggestion. An important detail here, queen e2 forks the bishop and the pawn, but the bishop can drop back to c5, x-ray defending e7. And black is fine here. Black is much better, actually. Up in exchange. So anyways, that's another way for white to be worse. After knight g8, White can also try the move bishop to d4, which is almost as popular as f4. And here you have to know the move queen to a5. Get the queen out. And there's a very important line where white plays the move e6. And again, if you don't know the theory, it's easy to get overwhelmed here because you can't take the pawn because you drop the bishop. And a mistake would be to take the bishop, allowing white to get the queen into d4 and hit the rook in the corner. So instead, all you have to do here is get the knight out to f6, knight f6, and black is better. And black is better because even though the king gets out to f7, it's perfectly safe here, and black has a massive pawn center. Bishop c4 check is met with d5. And if bishop b3, then black has an incredibly strong move here, which is a direct product of white delaying the castling. Who can spot this move? Kind of a classic idea. Yeah, it's e5. It's e5. This is an important move to have in your sort of toolkit. And if white takes on e5, some 2200s, 2300s have played like this, rook e8. White has to play f4. And now, I like the top engine move. Knight g4 is great. Also good is the move queen to b6 to prevent white from castling. And if queen f3, you prevent white from castling queenside by playing this mysterious-looking move bishop to h6. But it's not mysterious if you consider how you prevent castling. Now you can take e5. The pawn on f4 is pinned. So you've prevented white from castling either side, and now the king is stuck in the center, where it is going to be massacred by a combination of forces. Knight g4, bishop a6 is going to be very strong. This is like minus plus. And white's pieces are biting on granite on d5. But that's another nice line. If white takes the other way, e takes d7, well, then black plays bishop takes d7 check. And for example, if white plays bishop to c4, very strong here is the move bishop to g4, with the idea of meeting f3, another trick, with rook to d8. And if fg4, c5, and you're going to lose the bishop on d4, and black's going to get a devastating initiative here. Just devastating. One thing you should never be afraid of in these types of positions is moving your king. It's okay to move your king, because white's getting crushed in the center. Castles cd, and white loses a minor piece, because if the knight moves, you lose the bishop. Otherwise, black takes the knight. The rook on d8 is protected. So this is, a short overview of what to do after knight takes c6 and e5, which you're definitely going to face if you play the accelerated dragon for any length of time. All right. So in the game, our opponent plays this move a3, which is obviously a very strange move. It's not a very good move. I see that it has been played a fair number of times, but I think bishop c4 is a follow-up mistake after which white is simply in huge trouble. I mean, white should probably go bishop e2 to avoid the center fork trick, but even here, black, I think, should just go d5, and black is definitely slightly better. I mean, white has literally just wasted a move for no reason. I see that 7 games continued ed5, knight d5, knight c6, bc, and you should never be afraid of this pawn structure in the accelerated dragon because it's compensated by the tremendous activity of your pieces. If you look at the knight and your bishop, they're both aiming at the knight on c3. White is in trouble here. If bishop d4, then you can play knight takes c3, and white is forced to ruin their pawn structure. For example, bishop c3, now you trade. Now you get your queen to a5, and the attack on c3 is very powerful. The rook is coming to d8. This is, again, minus over plus is the evaluation here. So everywhere you look, black is already better here. But bishop c4 exacerbates the situation because of knight takes c4. And I wouldn't say that the game is over, but it's definitely borderline lost for white. Perhaps white should play bishop takes f7 check. And you should remember that when you face the center fork trick, the recommendation is usually to do what our opponent did. Or no, not to do what our opponent did. The recommendation when you're facing the center fork trick in most openings is to keep your bishop pair with a move bishop to d3. So for instance, let me take another opening where the center fork trick is common. Let's take a very primitive example. So in the 4 knights, if you play bishop c4, black has the move knight takes e4. And here, after knight takes e4, d5, the only way for white to not be worse is to play this move bishop to d3. And black has to recapture, and then white is able to preserve the bishop pair. And white is doing okay here. The position is equal, okay? I can show you in the perk, right? In the perk, there's a line where essentially here, whatever, bishop c4, castles, castles. Here, black can take on e4. And again, in this position, the best move for white is bishop to d3. de, bishop e4, and white is considered a little bit better in this line. But if we compare this to the position we had in our game, white essentially cannot do the same thing, because if white plays bishop d3 here, then we actually can take the other knight and we're just a pawn up. And if white takes first and then plays bishop d3, which might have been the lesser evil, this might have been the best that white can do. But here, in addition to taking this pawn, after which white is much worse, the engine actually recommends the devilish move bishop to a6, preventing white from castling and keeping the king confined in the center. And if white takes bishop c6, now we play bishop b2. And if white takes the rook, we give a nice little check on a5. And look at this line. If queen d2, bishop c3 wins the queen. If bishop d2, the queen swings to e5, then the bishop drops back to c3, and again, white loses the queen and all of his other pieces. So this is the power of preventing your opponent from castling, when you yourself are castled and in total safety. So anyways, this is why bishop d3 is not possible here. Now, our opponent's choice definitely made things worse for her. I think probably white should just castle here. Probably white should just castle here. And after dc, I mean, at least white's king is not unsafe. Of course, we're still up a pawn. We still have an attack on b2. It's minus plus, but of course the game continues. So sometimes you just got to castle out of it. White went into this endgame, but as it turns out, this endgame is just totally lost, because the attack on b2 is completely unstoppable. I mean, white probably has to play this move to stave off immediate defeat, but we're not even going to talk about this. Black is up a pawn here, and white is completely paralyzed. And you could even carry out a similar idea to what we did in the game. You could play like f5 and then e5 and creep up with your pawns in the center, and white is just totally out of squares. So this is awful. Okay, rook b1, bishop takes e3. The game is over immediately, and we don't have to talk about the rest. So pretty one-sided, but a good introduction to the accelerated dragon. As you can see, even at this level, a lot of players feel very, very lost on the white side of the accelerated, because it's not the most common Sicilian and it's not that often taught. And hopefully this gave you a good illustration of some of the introductory lines. Especially, we talked about knight takes c6 at length. But the key thing to remember is you're not afraid to bring the knight back to g8. And don't be afraid to analyze this with an engine on your own as well. The main line, by the way, the main line here is bishop c4, castles, and then bishop back to b3. Why does white need bishop b3? Well, you already know the reason for that. Here, black again has the center fork trick with knight e4. And by contrast to the game continuation, this is a better version for white. And here, white can, in fact, play bishop d3 and reach this position. But it is considered that black is even slightly better after queen c7, because you get the semi-open b file, you get the d file, and the accelerated bishop on g7 is just super, super strong here. But hopefully, I will even make Marotzis kind of interesting. All right. Let's get in another game, unless there are any questions. This was a very straightforward one, but, you know, I can't control how our opponents play. We can only control how we play. All right. Hope you enjoyed the speedrun. Bye.